I need you to pray for me today. You can pray two things, either that I don't have a coughing fit, or if I do have a coughing fit, that you'll just pardon that interruption while I cough a bit and drink some water. I'm battling a little bit of allergies still today, so you can entertain either one of those prayers right now. The technology is so wonderful today, isn't it? With smartphones, how you can text and communicate. But the problem is, some of us, a little older than the millennial cohort, don't do the thumb thing too good about typing, right? So, my daughters, they're flying 1 million words a minute, and I can't do it. I make mistakes. Thank goodness for Siri. Isn't Siri wonderful? Because you can just say whatever you want, but you have to be careful, don't you? Because I get typos doing this, but you can get typos talking to Siri. Have you ever done that? You say a little message, and if you don't check it right quick and you hit send, you can send out some amazing, very interesting little statements to your friends. But it still happens in church. Technology's not quite caught up, so we're still making bulletins, and you have them today. So we still get typos in bulletins. So I wanted to share with you a couple of typos. And if you ever see these, I know many of you are quick to point out when we have typos in our bulletin, but I don't think we've had any this bad. Here's a couple. One says, "Remember in prayer the many who are sick of our community." I think they meant to say sick in our community. One says, "Smile at someone who is hard to love and say hell to someone who doesn't care much about you." They meant to say hello, right? They left out. This is maybe the best one. The ladies' Bible study will be held Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. All ladies are invited to lunch in the fellowship hall after the B period, S period is done. Think about it. Now, if we did that one, I'm sure you would be urgently dialing or texting. You would let us know that we made some mistakes. Last week, we began continuing to talk about urgency. And within the message last week, I talked about two types of urgency. And I'm going to take a test. Take out some paper, and I want you to write down the two. I'm just kidding. I'm going to remind you the two types of urgency that I talked about. I talked about first order urgency, which is directly related inward, those things that seem to affect us. Kind of towards self. And I also talked about second order urgency for most of us. That's an urgency that is directed outward toward others. And then I also suggested that Jesus chose that second order urgency. That type, he operated mostly out of that urgency toward others, away from himself and onto the needs and concerns of other people. So Jesus had this incredible ability. He had this incredible ability to so identify with you and I in our lives that the life-threatening harm of a broken creation that sort of fell onto us or loomed over us was felt by him as if he were standing in our shoes. I said that last week, and that's why I used the little children's message today about standing in someone's shoes. In essence, Jesus felt the way we did. He knew what it was like. The question is, how did he do that? How was he able to feel what we feel? Because it seems to me to be an important skill, not just for living life, but if we're going to follow Jesus' steps. It seems to me we might want to look at this skill and see if there's anything we can learn from it, or if we might begin to imitate some of that, I guess, that love that would make such a difference for someone else. So we know Jesus is urgent. We've been talking about that now for weeks, the urgency of Jesus, but he's also intentional. His interactions with people they're more than just a conversation that we might have today over some snacks in the fellowship hall. They're empathetic. His conversations are empathetic. And that Jesus model that he's living out, we read about in scriptures today, we'll hear some of it today, that Jesus model teaches us that urgency is all in the eyes of the beholder, because Jesus sees with the eyes of urgency. Now, I want to share with you a Bible story today. If you want to open your Bibles to the Gospel of John, chapter 8, the first 11 verses there. This is a story you've heard many times. I promise you've never heard it like this today. That's why we're asking for God to open the scriptures, make them new to us, because there's always a little something more if we pay attention. So, here we go. Verse 1. Then each of them went home, but while Jesus went on to the Mount of Olives, early in the morning he came again to the temple. And all the people came to him and sat down, and he began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, the law of Moses commands us to stone such a woman as this. Now, what do you say?" The scripture says they said this to test Jesus, so they might have some charge to bring against him. But Jesus bent down and he wrote with his finger on the ground. They kept on questioning him. He straightened up and he said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again, he bent down and he wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders, and then Jesus finally was left alone with the woman standing right before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way. From now on, do not sin again." May God bless the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. We've heard this story before. How many have never heard this story ever? Let's ask it a different way. How many have heard this story before? That's a better response. So we've heard this story before, and here's the scene. Jesus is sitting down. It's almost as if he was in here today in worship. You know, they're in this synagogue. He's teaching, and all the people are gathered around, and they want to hear him teach. So it's kind of a special, sacred moment, kind of like right now in worship. And in the midst of that, they march this woman in and they place her. They're seated all around Jesus, and he's in the middle, as the rabbi would be doing, teaching. They bring her right through the circle, place her right there before Jesus. An embarrassing moment, to say the very, very least. She's exposed, really, isn't she? For all to see. And so they lay out that scenario. We're supposed to kill her. We should stone her. What say you, Jesus? What say you? You know, if you read books on dreams, you know that one of the most common dreams we have as human beings is this dream of being in public without clothes. It's a very common dream, and psychology will tell you there's something about our fear of being exposed to the world, unprepared for whatever's happening, and it's represented by that idea of being naked in public or naked to the world. And can you imagine had that been you? Not a dream, but in real life. Can you think of anything more humiliating that could happen to you than that? Be marched into a worship like this in that kind of setting. So what does Jesus do? We've read the story before. We know it. He stoops down It's always been a great question about this idea. Why does he stoop down? Why does he stoop down and draw in the dirt, in the dust? And there's lots of theories, and I just wanted to share a couple of the theories, and I'm going to give you my theory. But one theory is maybe he just wanted to distract attention away from her. I mean, he sort of sees what's happening. All eyes are on her. It's completely, overwhelmingly humiliating, and so he bends down and starts doing something in the dirt. So people are, what's Jesus? Let's see what he's going to do. Maybe he's writing his answer in the dirt. Who knows? Eyes go to him and off of her. That's one theory. Another theory is that Jesus, being a rabbi, did not want to look on her in that condition. That would have been not good. And so he's allowing dignity for her and for himself by not looking. So he looks away. He doesn't want to give in to the temptation. Probably the others are looking at her and making fun of her and all those kinds of things. He may have looked down and drawn in the dirt, but I think he really did see her. He saw her with the eyes of intentional urgency. Sometimes when we read these scriptures, we've heard them so many times, and we immediately think, we know what this means. We understand what Jesus is doing. We understand what he's about. So when we do that, we can limit God speaking to us. And sometimes we can miss an even more remarkable miracle. And I want to suggest there's one here today. I think what Jesus did that was so amazing in this story is he found a way to make every one of those accusers of that woman be that exposed woman. I want you to think about that. He found a way to put each of those accusers in her sandals, to feel what she was feeling in the moment. And here's how he did it. He created a personal identification for them to see themselves in her, to understand her experience in a personal way. So he offers those words, let those among you without sin cast the first stone. Those words started a process, I believe, in their minds, reminding them. Maybe that's what the dirt was, ashes to ashes, dirt to dirt. Maybe he's reminding them who they really are. But the greater message is this, that they are not creators, they are created. Because the Creator is the only one who can judge, truly judge. And that process in their mind is taking over. And they begin to realize they were in the exact same condition as the woman. They were all broken before God. They were all exposed for who they were and their condition. And they left. Isn't that amazing? They left her unharmed and they walked away. So what I want to look at today is this intentional urgency. That intentional urgency of Jesus changed this woman's story forever. Empathy will do that. Empathy has the ability to change someone's story. The word that's used in the Greek there for Jesus stooping down is kuphos, and it means to kind of get down in the dirt with somebody. We know that phrase, get down in the dirt with somebody. It means you're not so high and mighty, you're willing to get in there, get your hands dirty, like a boss who's willing to grab hold of some tools and stand side by side with his laborers. In essence, Jesus bent down. He's lowering himself to the level of her humanity and our humanity. And it created that sense of empathy. He's showing us how to do it. He's showing us how to be that for somebody else, how to create that atmosphere of empathy that can change somebody's story by creating a personal identification. The key to urgency is to see the world and to see people, individuals in our sphere, like Jesus would see them. That's what he wants us to do. He wants us to see people in the world, the people in this congregation, the people that we will deal with when we walk out these doors, to see them as he would see them. Because empathy brings urgency for care. And we can offer that kind of intentional urgency through empathetic identification with other people. If you've ever... Those of you who went through premarital counseling with me, there might be a couple in here. When I do premarital counseling, I teach a very simple way of communicating. It's a way to create empathy, and it really has three components. I'm not going to go into them today. I'm just going to list them very clearly, carefully, shortly. Here we go. One, you listen to somebody's story. We listen, but we don't hear. You have to listen deeper than just trying to figure out what you're going to say back next, or how you want to counter what was said, or offer your own 2 cents. But you listen to the story. The second part of really communicating, creating empathy, is to understand somebody's story, to begin to say, it makes sense to me. I can imagine Jesus seeing that woman brought up. He already knows the story. He's understanding her story. He understands her predicament. There's no arguing that she's in trouble. There's no argument. He can tell what's going to go on. He understands her story. The third part, when you understand somebody's story, then you can do the exercise I did with the children. Then you imagine yourself in their story. You imagine yourself standing in their shoes, and you ask yourself this question: if that were happening to me, how would I feel? That's empathy, and empathy brings urgency for care. That's what I think happened with those fellas that brought that woman to Jesus. As soon as they realized they were just like her, they were in the same boat, they were just as hurting as that woman, they couldn't do anything. They walked away. So Jesus' intentional urgency changed her story. It can change our story. I hope it's doing it even right now. If we're following the Lord, he's changing our story. And if that's true, if Jesus is clearly changing each of our stories day by day, minute by minute, second by second, it means we also have the ability, at least we're called upon to have that skill, develop that skill of changing somebody else's story. We can be part of that. It's not hard, because people matter to God. I said this the very first Sunday of this series when I quoted John 3:16, "For God so loved the world." You know that verse. God cares about people and loves people. And if we're going to love God and follow God, we do the same. We care about people. Jesus' interactions are always an intentional exercise in empathy. Read any of the passages where he's dealing with people, and it's always toward the lost. It's always toward the hurting. And I guess the greatest question I could ask in this church is to say this: how can this core purpose be supported by this faith community? It's not about us. We just sang Jesus is the center of it all. We didn't say Pastor Joe is the center of it all. It's not about us. When we imagine what it's like to feel and experience life as our neighbor, we gain access to love and an attitude of grace. You can't make that stuff up. You have to actually participate in the process. And when the threat of harm, as we said last week, is personalized, when we start to identify with somebody's pain, it gets a higher priority on our list. And that's what Jesus did. When he identified with that woman's pain, she went right to the top of the list. I mentioned last week that that idea of the asteroid, that if it's 10 years away, we don't think about it much. It's not much of an urgency. But if we act in a small way to affect even the smallest an inch of change of an asteroid 10 years out, by the time it gets near us, it will be nowhere near. We can actually redirect by thousands of miles by a small effort, a small change, a little urgent movement. And I asked you last week, what's your asteroid? What is it, that thing that if we do some small act now would make a huge difference into the future? In other words, what happens when we see others with empathetic eyes of urgency? I want to close with this story, and maybe it'll give you an idea of how to begin to put this into play in the life of our church and the people that you'll meet today and tomorrow. There was a teacher who asked her children to list all the kids in the class on 2 sheets of paper, write down every kid's name. And then she told them to think of the nicest things that they could think of about each one of those classmates. So they got a name and they write as many things they could think of, nice things about that classmate. It took the remainder of the class period for them to finish that assignment. They all wrote it down, and each student, when they left the room, they handed the paper to the teacher. Well, she took all of those papers and she collated together all of the responses of each kid for each student. She listed what everyone had said about each kid. So on Monday, when the kids came back in, she gave each student her list that had what all the students had said. So if it would have been for me, here's the things about Joe Wendorph that we think are really, really cool and nice. So every kid got a list of what their peers thought were the nicest things about them. And before long, the entire class was just starting to smile and be filled with joy. And she could hear the whispering of the students. I never knew that. I never knew I meant anything to anyone. I didn't know that person liked me so much. That's what most of the comments were eliciting in the students. So no one ever mentioned the assignment again. It's forgotten, put away. And she never discussed it in class or with their parents. But it didn't matter because the exercise had accomplished its purpose, and the students were happy with themselves, with one another, and that whole group of students moved through the class, done. Several years later, one of the students, this was during the Vietnam War, one of the students had gone off in the draft to Vietnam and was killed. And his teacher attended the funeral of that student. And the church that day was packed with all of his school friends. And one by one, those who loved him took that kind of last walk. It was an old tradition where you could walk by. They call it the pass by, the casket. So each student is passing by the casket. And the teacher was the last one to approach, and so she walked up there, and one of the soldiers, who was a pallbearer, came up to her, and he says, "You were Mark's math teacher, weren't you?" And she nodded yes. She said, "Mark talked a lot about you all the time." And so after the funeral, most of Mark's friends, those former classmates, they went together to lunch, and Mark's parents went there. They were kind of trying to reconnect. And the parents wanted to speak to that teacher. She came too. They said, "We want to show you something." His father reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet. And in that wallet, he pulled out a piece of paper, and he said, "This is what Mark had with him when he was killed in Vietnam. We thought you might recognize it." She opened the piece of paper, and it was very worn. You could see it had been folded and opened many times. And the teacher knew without looking what it was. It was those papers that she had the children write down the nicest things about each student. And the parents said, "Thank you so much for doing that." You can see how much Mark treasured it, that he carried it with him, even to death. And all of Mark's former classmates started to gather around. One was named Charlie, and he smiled kind of sheepishly and said, "I still have my list too. It's in the top drawer of my desk at home." Another fellow, Chuck was there with his wife, and his wife said, "Chuck asked me to put his paper in our wedding album." Another said, "I have mine too." Her name was Maryland. "It's in my diary." And then Vicky, another classmate, reached into her pocketbook, and she took out her wallet and showed her worn and frazzled list. She said, "I carry this with me at all times. I think we all saved our lists." Now, that teacher may have been a little thing years ago, but she enabled the eyes of intentional urgency. She helped comfort and change lives by allowing people to see, to stand in someone else's shoes. She changed the lives of everyone she touched. And if it weren't true, why else would she have kept the list? He would say, "Help change someone's story."